They called humans easy prey. They were dead fucking wrong. The Bajoran streets were empty when Timothy Carter landed his shuttle on Bajor Prime. The tall skyscrapers were dark. The city was dead silent. 35-year-old Timothy was humanity's most hardened diplomat. He'd come to Bajor to negotiate peace between the Bajorans and Cardassians. As soon as his boots hit the ground, a Bajoran man named Ilara crept from the shadows. Ilara's eyes were wide. His mouth trembled as he spoke. "Everyone's dying," Ilara croaked. "Some horrible plague. Starts with a fever and weird glowing sores. Then they go into comas and die in agony. It's spreading so fast. Thousands are infected. The government can't stop it." "What do you mean a plague?" Timothy narrowed his eyes. "The Bajoran medical tech should stop any plague." "It's not a normal disease," Ilara cried. "We think the Cardassians made it in a lab. Some kind of bioweapon. They want to wipe us out. Please, you have to help us find a cure, before it's too late." Timothy's blood ran cold. If this plague was a Cardassian bioweapon, it could spread beyond Bajor Prime. To other worlds. Maybe even to Earth itself. Billions could die, and a massive war could erupt between a dozen races. He had to find out the truth behind this outbreak, and fast, because if he failed, the human race itself might be doomed. Timothy and Ilara's next stop was the Bajoran Center for Disease Control. The BCDC building loomed before them, its sleek metal exterior glinting under Bajor Prime's twin suns. A chill ran down Timothy's spine as they entered, despite the warm air. Inside they were greeted by Dr. Krim Mora, a thin Bajoran man with wild eyes. He wore a long white lab coat that billowed as he paced. "This plague, this Bajoran blight as I've taken to calling it," Dr. Mora spoke rapidly, hands gesticulating. "It's like nothing I've seen. The way it targets Bajoran DNA markers with such specificity. It has to be engineered. A bioweapon." "What about a cure?" Timothy asked. "Any leads?" Dr. Mora froze mid-step. He turned to Timothy, gaze sharpening. "A cure? No, far too early for that. Now, I'm quite busy, so if you'll excuse me." He ushered them brusquely out of the lab before either could protest, slamming the door shut behind them. Timothy frowned at the closed door. The doctor was definitely hiding something. Hours later, in the small room he'd rented, Timothy's comm pinged with an incoming message. No sender ID. It was short, the words glowing on the screen. "Abandoned warehouse, outskirts of Ashala. Come alone, urgent." Against his better judgment, Timothy headed out into the inky Bajoran night, towards the specified location. The warehouse was a hulking shadow, lit only by the eerie green glow of bioluminescent insects. Inside, a trembling Bajoran man waited in the shadows. He stepped forward, face pale. "I'm Ari Beryl," he said. "Former research assistant at the BCDC. You're investigating the plague, right? I have information you need to hear." "Dr. Mora, he's been working on a secret genetics project. I think the blight is the result of one of his experiments gone wrong, and now he's trying to cover it up." Ari glanced around fearfully before continuing in a whisper. "There's more. I suspect the Cardassians were funding his research. If they get their hands on this—" A sudden crash sounded from the entrance. 5 armed Bajoran militants poured into the warehouse, weapons trained on Timothy and Ari. The leader stepped forward, his scarred face grim. "Step away from him, now." Ari lifted his hands, eyes wide with terror. Timothy slowly raised his own arms, mind racing. This mission had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. Timothy slowly lowered his hands, keeping his voice calm and even. "My name is Timothy Carter. I'm a human diplomat, here to investigate the plague and find a cure. We mean you no harm." The commander's eyes narrowed. "A likely story. You're coming with us, and that's final." "Please, you have to listen," Timothy implored. "This plague, the Bajoran blight, it could spread beyond Bajor. Billions could die. We need to work together to stop it." The commander, Klin Noran, scoffed. "Work together with outsiders? Never. The true way knows the truth. This plague is the Prophet's divine punishment for Bajor's sins. Trying to stop it is blasphemy. Timothy's heart sank. Religious zealots were always the hardest to reason with. As he tried to think of another approach, a sudden explosion rocked the warehouse. The militants staggered, momentarily distracted. "Run!" Ilara shouted from the entrance, tossing another homemade explosive. Timothy didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Ari's arm and sprinted for the exit, ducking as weapons fire erupted behind them. They burst out into the night, Ilara hot on their heels. "This way," Ilara panted, leading them down a maze of narrow alleys. The sound of pursuit echoed behind them, the True-Way militants relentless in their hunt. Timothy's lungs burned as they ran, twisting and turning through the winding streets of Ashala. Just when he thought they couldn't go on, Ilara pulled them into a decrepit, crumbling temple. "We can hide here," Ilara gasped, shutting the heavy door behind them. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they realized they were far from alone. Huddled in the shadows were dozens of Bajoran figures, their skin marred with glowing sores. Among them moved robed priests, offering comfort and prayer. An ancient Bajoran man approached, his face lined with age and wisdom. "Welcome, my children. I am Vedek Barail. You have found sanctuary in our humble hospice." Timothy stared in awe at the makeshift refuge. "You're caring for the infected, even though it's so dangerous." Barail smiled softly. "It is our duty to provide comfort to all, no matter their affliction. The prophets teach compassion, not fear." As Timothy watched the priests tend to the sick with such selfless devotion, a realization dawned. The key to unraveling the mystery of the Bajoran blight lay not just in science, but in understanding the very soul of the Bajoran people. As the ancient stone walls of the temple closed around them, Timothy, Ilara, and Ari huddled together, their minds reeling from the chaos they had just escaped. In the flickering candlelight, they began to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had engulfed Bajor. Ari's voice trembled as he spoke. "I remember overhearing Dr. Mora talking about a secret lab hidden deep in the catacombs beneath the city. That's where he was conducting his experiments, the ones that led to this." He gestured helplessly at the plague-stricken Bajorans around them. Timothy's eyes hardened with determination. "Then that's where we need to go. If we can find proof of what Dr. Mora has done, we can expose him and put an end to this horror." Ilara nodded grimly. "I'm with you. We can't let this continue." As they made their plans, Vedek Barail approached, his weathered face etched with concern. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said softly. "If you intend to brave the catacombs, allow me to guide you. I know those tunnels well. I've spent years ministering to the lost souls who dwell in those depths." Timothy hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We would be grateful for your help, Vedek Barail." With Barail leading the way, they descended into the catacombs, the air growing thick and heavy around them. The tunnels twisted and turned, an endless labyrinth of shadows and secrets. Strange, unsettling sounds echoed through the darkness. Distant moans, the skittering of unseen creatures, the drip of water on ancient stone. Suddenly Barail held up a hand, his eyes wide with alarm. From the shadows, a group of figures emerged, their bodies twisted and deformed beyond recognition. Their skin was mottled with glowing lesions, their limbs contorted at unnatural angles. They moved with a jerky, puppet-like gait, their mouths slack and drooling. "The Forsaken," Barail whispered, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Bajorans who were subjected to Dr. Mora's experiments, their minds and bodies shattered by his cruelty. They were cast down here, forgotten by the world above." Timothy and Ilara recoiled in horror, confronted with the terrible reality of what Dr. Mora had done. The Forsaken shambled closer, their eyes vacant and hungry. Barail held out his hands, his voice gentle but firm. "Peace, my children. We mean you no harm." To Timothy's amazement, the Forsaken paused, seeming to respond to Barail's calming presence. They parted, allowing the group to pass unmolested. As they pressed deeper into the catacombs, they finally found what they were seeking. the entrance to Dr. Mora's hidden laboratory. The doors were sealed with advanced biometric locks, glinting coldly in the light of their torches. Ari stepped forward, his face pale. I think I can unlock it. I still have access from when I was Dr. Mora's assistant. But as he placed his hand on the scanner, a chilling realization dawned on his face. He turned to Timothy and Ilara, his eyes wide with dread. The locks, they've been reprogrammed. The only way to open them now is with the biometric data of someone infected with the Bajoran blight. A heavy silence fell over the group. Timothy stared at Ilara, his heart sinking as the reality of his friend's words sank in. Ilara met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "I'm infected, Timothy," Ilara said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've kept it hidden, but the blight, it's inside me." He pulled back his sleeve, revealing a patch of sickly, glowing lesions on his forearm. Timothy shook his head, reaching out to grip Ilara's shoulder. "Ilara, no, you can't. There has to be another way." But Ilara stepped back, his jaw set. "This is the only way. My life, it can mean something now. I can help stop this madness, this suffering." Despite Timothy's protests, Ilara approached the biometric scanner. With a trembling hand, he placed his palm against the cool metal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hiss, the doors slid open, revealing the horrors within. Ilara staggered back, his strength failing. Timothy caught him as he fell, cradling his friend's weakening body. Ari looked on, his face a mask of sorrow and guilt. Inside the lab, the air was thick with the stench of chemicals and decay. Along the walls, tanks bubbled and churned, each containing a twisted, malformed creature suspended in murky liquid, failed experiments, discarded like broken toys. In the center of the room stood a machine, pulsing with a sickly green light. It hummed with a malevolent energy, its purpose both terrifying and unknown. As Timothy and Ari approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. Dr. Mora, his face gaunt and eyes wild, stepped into the light. He grinned, a manic, unhinged expression. Timothy stared in horror at the mad doctor. "You're insane, Mora. This is monstrous. You're playing with forces you can't control." Dr. Mora laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Control? I am in perfect control. The prophets have chosen me to usher in a new age. And you will not stand in my way." He lunged for the machine, his fingers flying over the controls. Timothy and Ari sprang into action, grappling with the doctor. They fought, a desperate struggle of flailing limbs and clashing wills. In the chaos, a stray blow struck the machine. It shuddered, sparks flying from its core. A crack appeared, widening with each passing second. From within, a sickly green energy began to leak, swirling and coalescing around Dr. Mora. The doctor screamed, his body convulsing as the energy engulfed him. His flesh rippled, bones shifting beneath the skin. Timothy and Ari stumbled back, watching in horror as Dr. Mora's form began to twist and change, his agonized cries echoing through the chamber. Timothy and Ari stumbled back as Dr. Mora's body convulsed, his screams turning into an inhuman shriek. His flesh rippled, bones cracking and reshaping. The doctor's skin split open, revealing pulsing, cancerous tissue beneath. A sickly green light emanated from the mass, casting an eerie glow on the lab. The creature that had once been Dr. Mora lurched forward, its movements erratic and unnatural. Its maw opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. The abomination let out a piercing cry that echoed through the chamber. To their horror, Timothy and Ari saw the failed experiments in the tanks begin to stir. The creatures twitched and spasmed, their own bodies undergoing a similar grotesque transformation. One by one, the glass tanks shattered, spilling their contents onto the floor. The mutated abominations dragged themselves forward, their limbs twisting and contorting at unnatural angles. They snarled and hissed, their eyes glowing with the same sickly green light as their creator. They sprinted for the exit, dodging the grasping claws of the nightmarish creatures. The abominations lurched after them, their movements jerky and unpredictable. Timothy and Ari fought their way through the horde, using whatever they could find as weapons. They smashed beakers and equipment against the creatures' misshapen heads, desperate to escape the lab. As they neared the entrance to the catacombs, they realized with growing dread that the sickly green energy leaking from the damaged machine was spreading. It seeped into the stone walls, causing them to pulse and throb like living flesh. The catacombs themselves began to change, the ancient tunnels warping and twisting. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the stench of decay and mutation. Timothy and Ari barely managed to seal the entrance behind them, using a heavy stone slab to block the pursuing abominations. They staggered into the temple, gasping for breath. But their relief was short-lived. The scene that greeted them was one of utter chaos and horror. The Bajoran blight, amplified by the energy from Dr. Mora's machine, had spread like wildfire. The once peaceful streets of Ashala had been transformed into a hellish landscape. The infected roamed the city, their bodies twisted and deformed. They moaned and shrieked, their minds consumed by an insatiable hunger. Vedek Barail emerged from the shadows, his face ashen. This is beyond anything I could have imagined," he whispered, his faith shaken to its core. He turned to Timothy and Ari, a desperate gleam in his eyes. "The ancient prophecies, they speak of a time of great darkness, a final battle between the forces of light and shadow. We must seek answers within them, if we hope to find a way to stop this madness." Timothy nodded grimly, his jaw set. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll uncover the truth behind these prophecies and find a way to stop the spread of this mutated blight before it consumes everything." Together, Timothy, Ari, and Barail set out into the city, navigating the nightmare-infested streets. They clung to the hope that somewhere within the ancient texts they would find the key to ending the horror that had engulfed Bajor. Timothy, Ari, and Barail pored over the ancient Bajoran texts, their eyes straining in the flickering candlelight of the temple's library. The musty smell of the crumbling parchment filled their nostrils as they searched for any clue that might lead them to a solution to the horrifying plague that had engulfed their world. Hours turned into days as they delved deeper into the prophecies, their minds reeling with the weight of the revelations they uncovered. The Bajoran blight, it seemed, was not a new phenomenon, but rather a cyclical event that had occurred throughout Bajor's history, a manifestation of a great evil that lay dormant beneath the planet's surface. The prophecies speak of a darkness that sleeps below, waiting to be awakened by those who seek to harness its power, Barail said, his voice heavy with dread. Dr. Mora's experiments must have inadvertently triggered this ancient menace. Timothy felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the true scope of the threat they faced. "We have to find a way to stop it," he said, his voice filled with determination. "There has to be something in these texts, some clue that can help us." As they searched, a passage caught Ari's eye. "Here," he said, pointing to a faded illustration. "It speaks of a remote mountain temple, said to house the tomb of an ancient Bajoran sage who faced a similar crisis in the distant past." Hope flared in Timothy's chest. "That's where we need to go," he said. "If this sage found a way to stop the blight before, maybe we can find the answers we need in his tomb." They set out at dawn, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the chaos and suffering they were leaving behind in Ashala. The journey through the treacherous mountain passes was arduous, the air growing thinner and colder with each step they took. As they climbed, the sound of pursuit reached their ears. The true way, the fanatical sect that believed the unfolding apocalypse to be the will of the prophets, had not given up their hunt. They saw Timothy and his companions as heretics, obstacles to be purged in the name of their twisted faith. Timothy, Ari, and Barail were forced to fight for every inch of ground, battling both the unforgiving elements and their relentless pursuers. They huddled together for warmth in the icy winds, their breath clouding the air as they pushed onward, driven by the desperate hope that they might find a way to save their world. Finally, after days of harrowing travel, they reached the ancient temple, its weathered stone walls rising out of the mist like a mirage. But as they approached, they found their path barred by a group of silent, enigmatic monks, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. "We are the guardians of this sacred place," one of the monks said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What brings you to the temple of the sage?" Timothy stepped forward, his voice raw with exhaustion and desperation. "We seek the wisdom of the sage," he said. "Our world is being consumed by a plague, a darkness that we believe the sage once faced and overcame. We need his help." The monk regarded them for a long moment, his eyes searching their faces. "The sage's tomb contains an artifact," he said at last. "The Orb of Unity, said to have the power to heal the wounds of the world and banish the darkness. But be warned, the orb can only be wielded by one who is pure of heart and willing to make the ultimate sacrifice." As the monks led them into the heart of the temple, Timothy, Ari, and Barail exchanged uneasy glances. The cryptic warning hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the incredible stakes they faced. Each of them knew that they would gladly give their lives to save their world, but what price would the orb demand? The chamber housing the sage's tomb was vast and echoing, lit by the eerie glow of bioluminescent fungi that clung to the walls. In the center of the room, a simple stone sarcophagus rested on a raised dais, the Orb of Unity pulsing with a soft, otherworldly light above it. As they approached the orb, Timothy felt a strange sensation wash over him, a mix of fear and awe that set his heart racing. He reached out to take the artifact, his fingers trembling as they closed around its smooth surface. The ancient temple corridors flickered with the warm glow of candlelight as Timothy, Ari, and Barail were led deeper into the sacred space. The air hung heavy with the weight of centuries, and the intricate murals adorning the walls seemed to whisper tales of an eternal struggle between light and shadow. Each step brought them closer to the sage's tomb, their hearts pounding with anticipation and dread. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. As he stepped into the light, Ari's eyes widened in shock and recognition. "Liran?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure lowered his hood, revealing a face that bore an uncanny resemblance to Ari's own, but hardened by years of bitterness and despair. Liran, Ari's estranged brother, stood before them, his eyes glinting with a feverish intensity. "Hello, brother," Liran said, his voice laced with a cold, mocking edge. "It's been a long time." Ari stared at his brother, his mind reeling with questions and emotions. Where have you been all these years? What happened to you?" Liran's lips curled into a sneer. "I've been serving a higher purpose, Ari. I've seen the truth that you and your companions are too blind to accept. The mutated Bajoran blight isn't a curse, it's a blessing, a necessary purging of the weak and unworthy." He took a step closer, his gaze boring into Ari's. "Join me, brother. Together we can harness the power of the Orb of Unity and shape a new future for Bajor, a future where only the strong survive." Harry felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. The brother he had once known, the one he had looked up to and admired, was gone, replaced by a twisted, fanatical stranger. He shook his head, his voice firm and resolute. "No, Liran, I can't follow you down this path. It's wrong, it goes against everything I believe in, everything I've learned. The path you've chosen can only lead to more suffering and destruction." Liran's face contorted with rage. "Then you've chosen your side," he snarled, "and you will die with the rest of the unbelievers." He raised his hand, and a group of true-way fanatics emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn. Timothy and Barail tensed, readying themselves for the impending battle. Chaos erupted as the true-way zealots lunged forward, their blades flashing in the candlelight. Timothy, Ari, and Barail fought back with desperate ferocity, their movements fluid and precise. The clang of metal against metal echoed through the ancient chambers, mingling with the grunts and cries of the combatants. In the midst of the fray, Liran made a desperate grab for the Orb of Unity, his fingers stretching towards the pulsating artifact. Ari saw his brothers move and leaped to intercept him, their bodies colliding in a tangle of limbs. As the battle raged on, Barail found himself locked in a deadly dance with a true-way fanatic. The zealot's blade flashed, finding its mark in Barail's side. The old priest stumbled, his hand pressed against the wound, his robes darkening with his own blood. Timothy, seeing Barail's plight, fought his way to the priest's side, his own blade a blur of motion. Together, they managed to push back the remaining fanatics, but the damage had been done. Barail sank to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Timothy knelt beside him, cradling the old priest's head in his lap. "Take the orb," Barail whispered, his voice faint but urgent. "Use its power to heal the world, even if it means sacrificing yourself. It's the only way." With trembling hands, Timothy reached for the orb of unity, his fingers closing around its smooth, pulsating surface. As he did so, a blinding light filled his vision, and he found himself standing before the spectral figure of the sage himself. The sage's voice echoed in Timothy's mind, a cryptic message that seemed to hold the key to everything. The path to unity lies not in the absence of darkness, but in the acceptance of its presence. Only by embracing the shadow within can one hope to find the light. As the vision faded, Timothy found himself back in the temple, the orb of unity thrumming with power in his grasp. He looked down at Barail's lifeless form, then at Ari, who stood over the unconscious body of his brother. In that moment, Timothy knew what he had to do. With a deep breath he made his decision, a fateful choice that would shape the destiny of Bajor and the entire galaxy. The orb pulsed in his hands, its light growing brighter and brighter, until it consumed everything in a blinding flash of pure radiant energy. In that moment of profound realization, Timothy's entire being resonated with the magnitude of his decision. The orb of unity pulsed in his grasp, its otherworldly light casting eerie shadows across the ancient chamber. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes and surrendered himself to the artifact's power. The sickly green energy of the mutated Bajoran blight surged forth, swirling around Timothy like a malevolent cyclone. It seeped into his skin, his bones, his very soul. He gasped as the weight of countless generations of suffering and pain flooded his senses, the unresolved trauma that had haunted Bajor for so long. Terry watched in awe and terror as his friend absorbed the darkness, his body convulsing with the strain. Timothy's eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural light. He screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the temple's halls. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The orb's light faded and Timothy collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving. Ari rushed to his side, cradling his friend's head in his lap. "Timothy, what have you done?" Ari whispered, his voice trembling. Timothy managed a weak smile, his face etched with lines of pain. "What I had to do," he rasped, "the only way to save Bajor." As the two friends clung to each other in the aftermath of the ordeal, a strange sensation began to sweep across the planet. In the ruined streets of Ashala, the twisted, mutated Bajorans suddenly stiffened, their bodies racked with violent spasms. And then, miraculously, the mutations began to reverse. Flesh knitted back together, bones realigned, and the sickly glow of the blight faded from their skin. The infected Bajorans blinked, as if waking from a long and terrible nightmare. But even as the physical scars of the ordeal began to heal, the emotional wounds ran deep. The Bajorans emerged into a world forever changed, a landscape haunted by the horrors they had witnessed and endured. Harris, his heart heavy with the loss of Barail and the betrayal of his brother, knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But as he looked out over the shattered remnants of his world, he felt a flicker of hope. They had been given a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild and create a new future for Bajor. He turned to Timothy, who stood beside him, his face a mask of grim determination. Ari knew that his friend would bear the burden of the darkness he had absorbed for the rest of his days, a constant struggle against the temptation to unleash its power once more. As the sun began to set over the ruined landscape, casting long shadows across the rubble, Timothy and Ari stood side by side, united in their resolve to forge a new path for their world. The scars of the past would never truly fade, but with each passing day, they would work to build a brighter tomorrow, free from the cycles of violence and oppression that had defined Bajor's history. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The sacrifices they had made, the losses they had endured, would not be in vain. Bajor would rise again, stronger and more united than ever before. As Timothy and Ari turned to leave the hilltop, a sudden, violent tremor shook the ground beneath their feet. They stumbled, struggling to keep their balance as the earth heaved and buckled. The sky overhead darkened ominously, clouds swirling into a vortex of malevolent energy. A sickly green light began to emanate from the ruins of Ashala, pulsing with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. The light grew brighter and more intense, casting a ghostly pallor over the devastated landscape. Timothy and Ari watched in horror as they realized the terrible truth. The mutated Bajoran blight, which they had believed safely contained within Timothy, had somehow been released once more. A deafening roar echoed across the landscape, a sound that seemed to rend the very fabric of reality. From the depths of the ruined city, a monstrous creature emerged, born from the twisted remnants of Dr. Mora's experiments and the corrupting influence of the blight. The creature was a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and technology, a nightmarish fusion of the organic and the mechanical. It towered over the surrounding buildings, its massive form blocking out the sickly green light of the sky. Multiple limbs, each one a twisted mockery of nature, thrashed wildly as the creature began to advance towards Timothy and Ari. Timothy stared at the approaching monstrosity, a sinking realization dawning upon him. The darkness he had absorbed, the blight he had taken into himself, had been merely a fraction of its true power. He knew with grim certainty that he had to confront this abomination alone. He turned to Ari, pressing the orb of unity into his friend's hands. "Take this," Timothy said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Lead our people to safety. Remember the sacrifices we've made, the battles we've fought. This is my fight now." Harry's eyes widened, his face a mask of anguish and despair. "Timothy, no, you can't face that thing alone. It's suicide." Timothy smiled sadly, clasping Ari's shoulder. "It's the only way. The blight is my burden to bear. I won't let it destroy everything we've fought so hard to save. Now go, before it's too late." Reluctantly, tears streaming down his face, Ari turned and fled, the orb clutched tightly to his chest. He didn't look back, couldn't bear to see his friend standing alone against the nightmare made flesh. Timothy turned to face the approaching horror, the weight of his own inner darkness suddenly feeling insignificant in the face of this new threat. He could feel the power of the orb, the lingering echo of its energy, still thrumming through his veins. The creature loomed over him, a mountain of twisted flesh and pulsating machinery. Its maw opened, revealing rows of jagged metallic teeth dripping with a viscous green ichor. A roar, deafening and filled with primal rage, erupted from its throat. Timothy stood his ground, his body tensed and ready. He knew this would be his final battle, his last stand against the darkness that threatened to consume everything he held dear. The two forces clashed, the creature's raw strength and size matched only by Timothy's determination and the power of the orb that still lingered within him. The struggle was titanic, a cataclysmic battle that would determine the fate of Bajor itself. Timothy fought with every fiber of his being, pouring all of his strength, all of his will into the desperate struggle. The creature lashed out with its monstrous limbs, smashing through buildings and tearing up the earth itself. But Timothy was relentless, his body aglow with the orb's energy. He struck back at the creature, his blows fueled by the power of unity, by the strength of the Bajoran spirit. The battle raged on, the landscape around them reduced to rubble and ash. Timothy could feel his strength waning, his body pushed to its very limits. But he refused to yield, refused to let the darkness triumph. In a final, desperate act of self-sacrifice, Timothy unleashed the full power of the orb, his own body acting as a conduit for its cleansing energy. A blinding light erupted from within him, engulfing the creature in a searing, purifying radiance. The monster screamed, a sound of pure agony and rage, as the light tore through its twisted form. Its flesh bubbled and melted, its mechanical components sparking and exploding. The blight, the corrupt essence that had given it life, was purged from its body, from the very soil of Bajor itself. When the light finally faded, the creature was gone, its form reduced to a pile of smouldering ash. And Timothy was nowhere to be seen, his body consumed by the power he had unleashed. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.